July 1945, harbor work detail. 20 Japanese prisoners standing in formation at dawn, waiting for their daily assignment from the American supervisors. The routine had become familiar. They would load or unload cargo ships, move supplies, sort equipment. Physical labor under guard. Not cruel labor, not punishment, just work. The Americans were peculiar that way. They treated prisoner labor as simply another logistical resource to be managed efficiently according to regulations. But this morning, the prisoners weren't focused on their assignment. They were focused on something in the harbor that didn't belong. Private First Class Kenji Watanabe had first noticed it 3 days ago. A strange vessel moored at Dock 7. Not a warship, he knew warships. Not a cargo ship, he unloaded those daily. Not a tanker or transport or any conventional vessel type. Something else. Something impossible to categorize. The vessel was small, barge-sized, concrete hull painted white. And on top, a structure that looked like a small building. 1 story, metal roof. Exhaust vents pumping heat into the tropical air. The sound of machinery running continuously. Generators, refrigeration equipment, something industrial happening inside that building. But strangest of all was the line. Every day, all day, a constant line of American sailors stretching down the dock. Dozens of men, waiting patiently. No urgency, no military necessity. Just waiting their turn to approach a window in that white building, receive something in a paper cup, and walk away eating it with wooden spoons. Corporal Hideo Tanaka spoke quietly without moving his lips, a skill useful when you didn't want guards noticing conversations. He mentioned that the strange vessel was still there, still operating, now on its 4th day. Watanabe didn't need to ask what he meant. Every prisoner in the detail had noticed. They had discussed it during breaks in hushed voices, trying to understand what they were seeing. Private Suzuki had suggested yesterday that maybe it was supply distribution, but that made no sense. Supplies came from warehouses through proper channels. The Americans were obsessed with proper channels. Tanaka had offered the possibility it was medicine, but healthy sailors didn't need daily medicine, and medicine didn't come in cups requiring spoons. Someone else had proposed special rations, but they had mess halls and food services. Why would rations be distributed from a mysterious barge? Every theory failed. Nothing explained it. Sergeant Matsumoto, who had been at this camp longer than any of them, knew something. Watanabe was certain. The sergeant had a knowing look whenever anyone mentioned the strange vessel, a slight smile, a refusal to explain. Yesterday, Watanabe had asked him directly what the barge was and requested he explain. Matsumoto had smiled that infuriating smile. He told Watanabe that he knew what it was, and that Watanabe would know soon enough. But telling him would ruin it. Some things needed to be seen to be understood. Watanabe asked if it was dangerous. Matsumoto assured him it was nothing dangerous, nothing military. He paused, then said it was the most American thing Watanabe would ever see, but not in the way he expected. That had made it worse. Now Watanabe was consumed with curiosity. Chief Morrison, their usual supervisor, was approaching with the interpreter. Morrison was fair, consistent, treated them like workers rather than enemies. He spoke to the interpreter, who turned to the prisoners. The interpreter explained that today's assignment was Dock 4, a cargo vessel with food supplies requiring standard unloading procedure. Chief Morrison added that if they worked efficiently and finished before 1500 hours, there might be an opportunity to see something they had been curious about. Morrison noticed their glances toward Dock 7 and smiled slightly. He said something else. The interpreter translated that, yes, Morrison meant that thing they kept staring at, and they could see it if they earned the opportunity. The morning work went faster than usual. The prisoners worked with focus, driven by curiosity. Cargo crates moved efficiently. Supplies sorted properly. They wanted to finish, wanted to see, wanted to understand. By 1400 hours, the cargo hold was empty. Morrison inspected the work, nodded approval, and gestured for them to follow. They walked along the dock, past other work details, past American sailors going about their duties, and slowly, step by step, they approached Dock 7. Approached that mysterious white barge with its running machinery and its endless line of sailors. Watanabe's heart beat faster. 3 months in this camp had shown him many American things. Their massive ships, their abundant supplies, their systematic organization. But something about this vessel felt different, important, like it would explain something fundamental. As they got closer, details became visible. The concrete hull, the white building, the exhaust vents releasing heat. The sound of machinery became distinctive. Generators, compressors, refrigeration equipment, something being kept very cold inside. The line of sailors remained dozens deep, young men mostly, talking, joking, happy, actually happy, anticipating something. Whatever was at the end of that line made them willing to wait 15 minutes in tropical heat. Morrison led them to the end of the line. He said something to a nearby sailor who turned, saw the Japanese prisoners, and smiled. The sailor said something back. Both men laughed. The interpreter translated Morrison's words, explaining that he had told the sailor these were prisoners from a work detail that had performed well. The sailor had responded that any man who works hard deserves this. Deserves what? The prisoners wondered, but no one voiced the question aloud. The line moved slowly forward, each sailor reaching the window, receiving a cup, walking away satisfied. The distribution was quick, about 15 seconds per man. Efficient. Watanabe watched a sailor receive his cup and take a bite of whatever was inside. The sailor's eyes closed briefly. An expression of pure satisfaction crossed his face. Then he walked away, eating slowly, savoring each spoonful. What could create that reaction? They moved closer, 5 sailors ahead of them. Then 4, 3, 2, 1. Then Watanabe was at the window. An American sailor in a white apron stood inside holding a large metal scoop. Behind him, Watanabe could see industrial equipment, metal drums, refrigeration units, and rising from everything, cold mist, like winter breath. The sailor scooped something from a drum and placed it in a paper cup. He handed it to Watanabe with a wooden spoon pressed into the side. He said something in English with a smile. Watanabe looked down at what he was holding. In the paper cup was a perfect white scoop of something frozen, something that shouldn't exist here. The interpreter spoke quietly beside him, explaining that it was ice cream, vanilla ice cream, and that this barge produced it for the sailors, ice cream. Watanabe stared at the cup. Ice cream. He had tasted it once before, as a child. His father had taken him to Tokyo for a special trip, and they had stopped at a Western-style restaurant. The ice cream had cost his father half a day's wages. It had been precious, a rare moment of childhood joy. And now, standing on a dock on Guam, a prisoner of war, he was holding another serving. He lifted the wooden spoon with a hand that trembled. He took a small bite. Cold exploded in his mouth. Sweet, creamy, rich. The taste of milk and sugar and vanilla. The taste of childhood and peacetime, and a world that seemed impossibly distant. Around him, other prisoners were also eating. Some quickly, some slowly, savoring. And some, like Tanaka beside him, were crying, actually crying, tears running down their faces as they ate. Watanabe felt his own tears starting, not from the taste, from understanding, from suddenly comprehending something that words couldn't quite capture. They had built this, a floating factory, with refrigeration equipment and generators and personnel. They had created an entire system to produce ice cream, in the middle of a war, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. For morale, to make their sailors happy. While Japanese soldiers had been eating grass and bark to survive, the American sailors in line watched the crying prisoners with expressions of confusion and sympathy. They didn't understand the tears. How could they? For them, ice cream was normal, common, something available anytime. But for Watanabe, this ice cream, This impossible, ridiculous, completely unnecessary frozen dessert explained something fundamental about the war, about why Japan had lost, about the vast, incomprehensible gap between what Japan could do and what America could do. He finished eating slowly. The cup was empty, but he kept holding it, looking at the paper container that had held something frozen and sweet. Something that required refrigeration technology and power generation and ingredient logistics and systematic organization. Morrison spoke through the interpreter, telling them they could keep the cups if they wanted, as reminders. A reminder. Yes. Watanabe folded the paper cup carefully and tucked it into his pocket. He would keep it. He would need to remember this. Would need proof later that he hadn't imagined it. They walked back to their barracks in silence. What was there to say? How do you discuss ice cream barges when you come from a military where starvation was common? How do you process the reality of frozen desserts made for morale when you remember soldiers dying from malnutrition? That night, lying on his cot, Watanabe pulled out the paper cup and looked at it in the dim light. Such a simple thing. A paper cup that had held ice cream. But what it represented was everything. The next morning, during the pre-dawn formation, Matsumoto approached him and asked if he now understood. Watanabe confirmed that yes, now he knew. Matsumoto asked what he thought about it. Watanabe explained that he understood what Matsumoto had meant about it being the most American thing, about it explaining everything. He said the Americans could afford to make ice cream during a war, on floating barges, because they had so much that using resources for morale didn't strain their capacity. They weren't choosing between ammunition and ice cream. They had enough for both. Matsumoto agreed. Watanabe continued, noting that while America had both ammunition and ice cream, Japan had been choosing between ammunition and food, and often couldn't have enough of either. Matsumoto again agreed. Watanabe looked back at Dock 7, where the white barge sat. Already operating at dawn, already producing batch after batch of frozen dessert for another day of American sailors who expected ice cream as normal. He asked Matsumoto if Japan had ever really had a chance to win. Matsumoto told him no, they hadn't. He explained that the nation which can make ice cream barges while fighting a global war is not a nation you can defeat by fighting harder or being braver. You cannot bridge that gap with courage. Watanabe thought about his fellow soldiers, the ones who had died, the ones who had starved, the ones who had fought with equipment that was obsolete and supplies that never came, all of them trying to defeat an enemy that made ice cream for morale purposes. He said quietly that he needed to remember this. When he went home, when people asked what happened, he needed to be able to explain not just that they lost, but why. And this, he touched the folded paper cup in his pocket. This explained it better than anything else could. The work detail resumed. Days passed. The ice cream barge remained at its dock, operating continuously, serving line after line of sailors. A permanent fixture of the harbor, a permanent reminder of American abundance. Watanabe worked efficiently, kept his thoughts private, observed everything, and every day he saw that barge and remembered the taste of ice cream and understood more deeply what Japan had challenged. 2 weeks later, during an evening meal, new prisoners arrived. Fresh captures from recent fighting. They looked skeletal, desperate, confused by the organized camp, by the food, by the systematic way everything operated. One of the new prisoners, a young private who couldn't have been more than 18, sat next to Watanabe. He asked hesitantly if this was real. The food, the barracks, whether the Americans really treated prisoners like this. Watanabe confirmed that, yes, this was real. The young private said they had been told the Americans would torture them, kill them, that they had been told capture was worse than death. Watanabe told him simply that he had been lied to about many things. The young private acted slowly, like he was afraid the food would disappear. He asked what else they had lied about. Watanabe thought about how to answer, about everything he had learned, about abundance and efficiency and systematic organization. about industrial capacity that seemed limitless, about ice cream barges. He said finally that they had lied about everything. About American strength, about American resources, about their chances of winning. All lies. And the truth, he paused. The truth was stranger than any lie they had told them. The young private asked what he meant. Watanabe pulled out the folded paper cup. He smoothed it carefully on the table. He pointed to the barge at Dock 7, the white one with the building on top, and asked if the young private could see it. The private confirmed he could see it and asked what it was. Watanabe explained that it was an ice cream factory, a floating factory that produced ice cream for American sailors, 10 gallons every 7 minutes, built for morale purposes to keep their troops happy. The young private stared at him and said that was impossible. Watanabe told him he had thought so too, but it was real. He had tasted the ice cream. This cup had held it. He looked at the paper and continued, explaining that the barge, that ridiculous, impossible barge, explained the entire war better than any battle report or strategy analysis. The Americans could afford to make ice cream while fighting. Japan couldn't afford to make rice while fighting. That gap, that fundamental gap in capacity and resources, had decided everything before the first shot was fired. The young private was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked if they had ever had a chance. Watanabe told him no, they didn't. But they hadn't known that. Their leaders might have known, probably did know, but they sent soldiers to fight anyway. Sent them against an enemy that makes ice cream barges. Other prisoners were listening now. The conversation had drawn attention. Matsumoto spoke up from across the table, saying Watanabe was right. Everything they had been told was lies designed to keep them fighting. But the truth was simple. America had resources Japan couldn't match. Industrial capacity Japan couldn't compete with. Organizational systems Japan couldn't replicate. And yes, ice cream barges that Japan couldn't imagine building. A week later, Tanaka approached Watanabe during a break. He said he had been thinking about the ice cream barge. Watanabe remarked that they all had been thinking about it. Tanaka clarified that he meant specifically about what it meant, about what it told them. He sat down in the shade and continued. The refrigeration equipment alone must require significant power. The generators to run that equipment need fuel. The ingredients need shipping. The personnel need training. Every element of that barge requires resources and organization. Watanabe agreed. Tanaka went on, noting that the Americans had all of it. Not struggling to provide it, not rationing it, just had it as standard operating procedure. That was what he couldn't comprehend. The casualness of it. The way making ice cream was just routine. Watanabe nodded, saying he had thought about that too. In the Japanese military, everything was scarce. Every resource was precious. Every decision was about trade-offs. But the Americans didn't seem to face those constraints. They operated like resources were unlimited, because for them, resources might as well be unlimited compared to what Japan had. Tanaka concluded that the war was decided by economics, by industrial capacity, not by tactics or courage or fighting spirit. Watanabe confirmed this. Economics. Boring, simple economics. They could produce more. They could afford more. They could sustain operations at scales Japan couldn't match. And ice cream barges were just one visible symbol of that capacity. The workdays continued. Harbor duty. Loading and unloading. Moving supplies. The routine was constant, and always in the background, that white barge at Dock 7. Operating, producing, serving. A permanent reminder of what they had fought against. Sometimes, watching American sailors line up for their ice cream rations, Watanabe felt anger, not at the Americans, at his own leaders, the ones who had sent men to fight knowing the truth, knowing about American industrial capacity, knowing the war was unwinnable. They had lied, sent soldiers to die. For what? For pride? For ideology? For reluctance to admit defeat? Other times he felt strange gratitude, not for defeat, but for survival, for being here, alive, watching ice cream barges instead of dying in some jungle or burning in some ship. The capture had saved him, given him time to understand, time to see the truth. In August, the war ended. Atomic bombs. Surrender. The news came through the camp administration. Japan had capitulated. The fighting was over. The prisoners reacted with mixed emotions. Relief that the dying was done. Shame at surrender. Fear about going home to a defeated nation. And underneath everything, a complicated sense that maybe, just maybe, surrender was mercy. That continuing to fight would have meant only more death for no purpose. Watanabe stood at the harbor that afternoon, looking at the ocean, looking at the American ship still operating, looking at that ice cream barge still serving sailors who no longer needed to fight but still deserved ice cream. Morrison approached with the interpreter. He spoke briefly. The interpreter translated that Morrison wanted them to know repatriation would begin soon, that processing takes time, but they would go home. Watanabe asked the interpreter to thank Morrison for telling them. Morrison said something else. The interpreter translated with slight hesitation. Morrison hoped they would remember that Americans weren't monsters, that they had followed rules, that they had tried to be fair. He knew Japan had been told otherwise, but he hoped they would remember the truth. Watanabe thought about that, about 3 months of captivity, about adequate food and medical care and fair treatment, about systematic efficiency instead of cruelty, about ice cream given to enemy prisoners. He told the interpreter to convey that he would remember and that he had a paper cup that proved he would remember. Morrison looked confused. The interpreter explained about the ice cream. Morrison smiled and said something. The interpreter translated that Morrison said ice cream was worth remembering. Worth remembering. Yes. But not for the reason Morrison thought. Not because it was delicious or kind, but because it explained everything. Because it was the perfect symbol of why Japan lost. Repatriation processing began in October. Watanabe was scheduled for transport in late November. The weeks passed slowly. Work continued. The harbor operated. The ice cream barge remained. On his last day at the camp, Watanabe walked to Dock 7 one final time. He stood and watched the barge, watched sailors getting their rations, watched the smooth, efficient operation that produced frozen desserts with machine-like regularity. Matsumoto found him there and asked if he was saying goodbye to their friend. Watanabe confirmed it, remarking that it was a strange thing to feel attached to. An enemy ice cream barge. Matsumoto corrected him, saying they weren't attached to it, but to what it taught them about reality, about what they were actually fighting. That was worth remembering. Watanabe showed the paper cup, now worn and creased from being carried for months. He explained this was physical evidence so he could prove to himself later that he hadn't imagined it. Matsumoto said that was good. Watanabe would need proof. People at home wouldn't understand, wouldn't believe. They would still think American victory came from luck or numbers or some other explanation that made sense to them. They wouldn't comprehend that it came from having economies and industries so powerful that ice cream barges were possible. The transport ship departed in late November. Watanabe stood at the rail as Guam receded into the distance. He watched the harbor grow smaller, watched that white barge become a dot, then disappear. But he kept the paper cup, kept it in his pocket, kept it as evidence and reminder and symbol. The voyage home took 2 weeks. During that time, Watanabe thought about what he would say, how he would explain, what words could possibly convey the truth to people who had never seen American abundance firsthand. Japan appeared on the horizon in December. The coastline was dark, burned. Even from the ship, the destruction was visible. Cities reduced to rubble, forests burned, everything destroyed. This was what defeat looked like. This was the price of challenging a nation that made ice cream barges. He disembarked at Yokohama and walked through ruins. Buildings collapsed, infrastructure destroyed, people thin and desperate, wearing rags, searching for food. The nation that had started the war was broken beyond recognition. His family's village was a week away on foot. The trains weren't running reliably. Roads were damaged, so he walked, carrying nothing but his clothes and a folded paper cup that had once held ice cream. The village appeared smaller than he remembered. Houses damaged, fields neglected, people fewer than before. His family's home was partially standing, enough to live in. Barely. His mother opened the door. She stared. Didn't recognize him at first. Then she started crying. She called for his father. They embraced him like he had returned from the dead. Which, in a way, he had. That night, after a sparse meal of rice porridge, they asked questions. Where had he been? What had happened? How had he survived? Watanabe told them about capture, about the camp, about work details at the harbor, about American efficiency and organization, and about the ice cream barge. He pulled out the paper cup, smoothed it on the table, showed them the evidence. He explained quietly that the Americans had made ice cream on floating barges for their sailors to keep them happy, while Japanese soldiers were eating bark and dying from starvation. And that single fact, he said, explained why they lost better than any military analysis ever could. His father looked at the paper cup, touched it gently. He repeated the words, ice cream, during a war, with a tone of disbelief. Watanabe confirmed it, because they could afford it, because their resources were so vast that using some for morale didn't strain their capacity, because they understood that happy soldiers fight better, because they had the industrial capability and organizational systems to build floating factories for desserts. His father said quietly that Japan had none of that. Watanabe agreed. They had shortages and desperation and soldiers dying from malnutrition. Japan was fighting for survival. America was fighting with excess. You cannot win that fight. The outcome was decided before it started. His mother was crying quietly. She told him that his brother had died on Okinawa, fighting to the end. He could have surrendered, could have lived. Watanabe felt the familiar anger return at leaders who had lied, who had told soldiers that capture was worse than death, who had sent men to fight knowing the war was lost. He said he was sorry his brother believed the lies. Sorry surrender seemed impossible to him. Sorry he died when he could have lived. They sat in silence, the paper cup on the table between them, evidence of a truth that changed nothing but explained everything. In the years that followed, Japan rebuilt slowly. American occupation brought food aid, infrastructure help, new systems. The nation transformed. Watanabe found work in a factory, married, had children, built a life, watched his nation rise from ashes to become an economic power again. He kept the paper cup, kept it in a drawer, took it out sometimes, and remembered. His daughter found it once when she was 10. She asked what it was. He told her the story. About the barge, about the ice cream, about what it meant. She asked why he kept an old cup. He explained that someday, when people forget, when they make up stories about the war that sound heroic, he could show them this cup and tell them the truth. They lost because their enemies made ice cream and Japan couldn't make rice. Simple, brutal, true. Kenji Watanabe died in 1994 at age 70. Among his effects, his family found that paper cup, still folded carefully, still preserved after nearly 50 years. His daughter donated it to a museum in Tokyo that collected artifacts from the Pacific War. The curator found Watanabe's diary among his belongings, pages of observations from the camp, and several entries about the ice cream barge. One entry, dated just before his death, read, "I kept this cup for 50 years. When people ask why Japan lost, I show them this. War is decided by whoever can afford to make ice cream while fighting. We couldn't afford rice. They made ice cream. That was the war. That is always the war." The museum created a small display. The paper cup in a glass case, his diary entry beside it, a photograph of an American ice cream barge, and a simple placard. This cup held vanilla ice cream produced on a floating factory at Guam in July 1945. To the prisoner who kept it, it represented the economic gap that decided the war. In 2015, an American veteran visited the museum. 90 years old, he had served on a destroyer in the Pacific. He stopped at the display, read the placard, looked at the paper cup, started crying. His grandson asked if he was okay. The veteran nodded. He said he had eaten that ice cream from barges just like that. He thought it was normal. He never understood what it meant to them. Never knew they were starving while Americans had desserts. Before leaving, he spoke to the curator through his grandson. He said people need to know this. That war isn't just about fighting. It's about everything behind the fighting. The factories, the farms, the supply chains, the economy, everything. He was right. That was exactly what Watanabe had tried to preserve. Today, the display remains. The paper cup sits in its case, protected. A piece of paper that once held frozen dessert and now holds historical truth. Students visit, veterans remember, and the lesson continues. Kenji Watanabe understood what that ice cream barge meant, what it represented, what it revealed, and he spent 50 years making sure others could understand too. All because of one paper cup, one scoop of vanilla ice cream. One moment on a dock in July 1945, when a starving prisoner tasted American abundance and understood, completely and irrevocably, why his nation had lost. They made ice cream. Japan didn't. Everything else was just dying.